Care to chat? Hello and welcome to this episode of the Northern Ireland Social Care Council's popular podcast, Care to Chat. I'm Wendy Austin and it's my great pleasure to host this series, hearing the stories of social care workers and social workers and the fantastic jobs that they do, and hearing as well from their clients, and also about the many different aspects of the work itself, from children's services to probation, from family support to helping people deal with loneliness, which is what we're talking about this time. It's a huge problem in our communities, especially here in Northern Ireland, and that's despite us thinking that we're a pretty friendly bunch. It doesn't seem to make any difference. 1 in 5 people experiences loneliness, and unlike the rest of the UK, we have no loneliness strategy. So how does social work fit in to dealing with loneliness? Well, let's find out. With me, I have Stephen McMillan. Stephen's a social worker with the Community Older People's Team in South Belfast with Belfast Health and Social Care Trust. Aislinn Delaney is social work lead in the Northern Ireland Hospice, and Jeanine Toner is team manager, Northern Ireland Refugee Support Service with Barnardo's. It's great to have you all here today, and particularly to be looking at this maybe at a slightly different level to a previous podcast that we did on loneliness, which focused more on the role of social care and community organisations. So the two episodes, of course, are complementary, but today we're going to focus on social work. How, Stephen, does loneliness impact on the people that you work with?
So for older people, it's a multifaceted idea, and it has many undercurrents in relation to how they manage it. What we find with our caseload is it is much more complex and becoming more and more complex in how we deal with older people and how they manage their loneliness. A lot of the older people have, over their life course, had a lot of experiences, trauma being a big impact, the troubles that they've experienced and the issues that come along with that there. The loss of family members has been a massive thing for them. Their husbands, their wives, their friends and family have all left and reduced their circles down into themselves in some cases. And for those people, it is difficult for them to find a way of rebuilding those connections. They lose the connections by their spouses passing away. That circle then leaves them, and we're finding that the older people, they have a knowledge of a community base, and as we've spoken previously in the meeting before this, that they used to speak over the wall, have a conversation with their neighbours. There would have been very much a community element back when they were younger, and having that integration where society's moved more individualistic, and we are more focused on ourselves nowadays, and it's trying to reintegrate them back into that community sense, and we've been finding COVID had a massive impact in putting that isolation in place, and older people are struggling to get out of those safety bubbles, when they get into a certain way of things, and consistency becomes a safety net for them. Looking at 4 walls and staying inside has sort of given them that false idea that they're safer at home than they are out in the community, and it's really about trying to get people back out and integrating with their neighbours and local shops and stuff like that there, where they can have those connections again.
Jeanine, I suppose one of the things that has changed actually is the community itself, and one of the reasons for that has been some of the people with whom you work.
Yes.
Refugees. There are some communities that are unrecognisable now to what they would have been like 10 years ago. So maybe that has an impact on the having a conversation over the garden wall thing. It's also very difficult for those incomers themselves sometimes, isn't it?
It does, or it is. Excuse me. So language being a huge problem, because if you don't speak English, then how? You have to find unique ways, creative ways to actually communicate with your neighbours, and also with communities growing and becoming so much more different, it does lead to suspicion and stigma and anger. Just this morning, I seen, unfortunately, on social media, a post in a town. On a poster, a poster on a lamppost that said, no immigrants, locals only. It's time we focus just on our own. And trying to rectify that with helping families to settle into an entirely new culture, new country. And I guess the key thing being is that it's not by choice. They didn't get up and leave everything behind by choice. So it's been a forced situation, and you want them to come to a country, come somewhere where they feel safe. And largely they really do. They really have in Northern Ireland. But what happens if you haven't got the language, if you've left family behind, if you've lost people, in wars in Middle East or in Ukraine and different countries, and you need to start relying on those around you much more, whereas previously you might have been quite independent, and you also would have had the families very often had much larger extended families to rely on, and they come here, largely alone with their spouses, with their children. There's often disabilities that add to the situation. Ageing population, amongst refugees becomes a problem also. Being able to access health and social care the way any of us at the table here can walk in and just speak to say what we need, and that's not always possible. Trying to access interpreters to be able to communicate correctly what you need to say, or have, for example, a doctor communicate to you in a way that you're going to understand. So there are a lot of different, I suppose, levels that can exacerbate loneliness within a refugee family, within the refugee community. The stigma, the culture, hate crime, as I've just mentioned. Also things like young people who maybe were quite young when they arrived in Northern Ireland have grown up to become adults, and their life very much changes. They might still have parents very much relying on them to be their interpreter or to help them, navigate living in Northern Ireland and how to do that. They may be a female who the family expects to get married quite young, so their life can change drastically. They may be having that extra bit of struggle to access, say, university education, which is something that they want to do. Education is really important. They want to do that to, improve their future. But all of that has a different level of difficulty when you're not born here and you don't speak the language of here. So there's a whole lot of different reasons why the refugees that we work with can feel disconnected. And while they very much, there's a growing, for example, Syrian culture in Northern Ireland. So while they may be able to connect with people from their own culture, it's much more difficult to connect with, the Northern Ireland culture and the people within it, and finding ways to do that, finding ways to be open while still feeling safe to do so.
Yeah, it's very complex, isn't it? And that whole business of community, I wonder, Aisling, how do you look at community when you're dealing in a hospice setting with people who might never actually be back out in that community again, and who I'm guessing are critically aware of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think for adults, certainly, who have a life-limiting diagnosis or entering into their end-of-life phase, loneliness is almost like an invisible issue. Because at the bedside, there may be a lot of people who are there to pay their respects or to spend some time with their loved one. However, that person can be isolated and alone and lonely on lots of different domains. So physically, psychologically, socially and spiritually, that they're in a different place in their life. And whenever somebody's entering into their dying phase, into their last weeks, days, months, community becomes much smaller. They can't access the same level of social prescriptions, activities, groups as an able-bodied person would be able to. So community becomes much smaller, and the individual can absolutely seem like they're losing touch with everything that was important to them. Physically, they can't do what they used to. They're perhaps becoming more reliant on being in bed, becoming more reliant on people to do things for them. People come to them rather than them going to people, and they're very much at the mercy of other people. And when they can do that, and socially, their circle becomes much smaller. And I suppose one of the biggest factors we would see would be that existential or spiritual dimension as well, where that individual is so much is grappling so much with what's next. Those sort of thoughts and feelings that come with being at end of life. And that's something that they're navigating on their own, because nobody else knows how they feel. And that we know that for those who are terminally ill and who are approaching end of life, that loneliness exacerbates lots of different things for them, including their physical symptom burden, and that being lonely can really increase the need for medical and healthcare professional involvement towards the end of life. So it's definitely an invisible issue, but community becomes much smaller and more difficult to navigate when a person is less able to do what they used to do, and it becomes more difficult for them to access the things that were once important to them.
How can you help them then in that situation to deal with loneliness?
I think that one of the biggest things that a social worker can do is not be afraid of talking about loneliness. I think sometimes in addressing that taboo issue, it helps to break down the barriers and to see actually what does this person need. And sometimes it is just that honest and frank conversation that we shouldn't be frightened of. I suppose in my situation and in my work, we're having conversations about death and dying, which can feel really frightening to put yourself out there. But actually, it's really important for that individual to talk about what's on their mind and to share that. And sometimes we find that we're the first person that has done that. We're the first team that have asked them how they're feeling and have explored all of those different emotions. And in exploring that, it helps to take away that loneliness, because what people want is human connection. And that's something that we're absolutely primed to do. We can't always fix what is going on. And certainly when it comes to palliative care, we know that we cannot fix their physical condition anymore, but we can make things better. And one of the worst things that we know from people experiencing palliative care is being told there's nothing more we can do for you, because there absolutely is more that we can do for you. We can make you more comfortable. We can help you to live as well as possible. But to do that, we need to address your loneliness. And I think that in naming that and in talking openly about it is one of the very best basic first steps that we can take to helping people to feel more connected.
Stephen, what about you? How does your training as a social worker and your particular interest in loneliness, you've done courses and so on in it as well, how does that help you to address loneliness, to make things better, as Aislinn just said?
It's very much as Aislinn says, it is having that conversation, and for us it's developing that relationship, having that ability to show people that they still have those ability to make connections, and that the isolation that they develop themselves can be broken. We have community-based assets at day centres, and there's a growing environment for older people in supported living, where they're developing like coffee stands, and we're finding a lot more of the people that move into supported living are congregating around these coffee stands, having a conversation and developing those relationships within themselves. And
like a water cooler moment.
Yeah, a wee bit like we would in office space, having that conversation. And it really is getting older people to realise that the benefits of having those conversations will improve their health, will give them that uplift in their mood and their mentality, and give them a wee bit of confidence back, and a bit of control in themselves of going forward on how they want to live the remainder of their lives. Much as Aislinn says, having that discussion with them gives people that self-worth back, the belief in themselves. I can do this. I may have my issues, but it's how I manage those and how I reintegrate back in. And that's one thing that we're definitely finding, as previously said, there's a lack of community availability for older people that used to be there prior to COVID. There used to be luncheon clubs and dinner dances and stuff like that there, where they've sort of went because of the cost of living and stuff like that there, and community groups not having the funding to do that, and they prioritise the children and stuff like that there who need those social engagements as much as the older people. But I think that it's community is much more focused on the younger people, and the older people sort of slide by, and they've been there, they've done that. They can reach out to us rather than it being a case of the community reaching back out. And COVID had sort of pointed older people in that direction, where community sort of stepped up, that they started going to older people and bringing bits and pieces of shopping and gas and electric because of the fear of older people going out. And we started to see sort of buds of that old community coming back, and with lockdown and stuff, and we're hoping that that's something that we can push on and sort of get people back engaged in checking on your neighbours, just having that 5-minute conversation over the wall or over the fence and seeing how they're doing, and having that, that connection. Just, it takes 5 minutes to say hello, but you don't know how important that can be in someone's day.
Yeah, indeed. I'm thinking about blue lights. We've mentioned it a few times in our various podcasts, and I think in one of the recent episodes, the lady who had made an entire tea trolley of cakes and buns and so on, which were for the two police whenever they arrived, because, as she said, I think when they were leaving, Stevie said to Grace, I think she's lonely, and she clearly was, and they were completely stuffed with goodies. But your training as a social worker, Jeanine, communication skills, and it's very much a relationship-based profession as well. What are the challenges there for you when you're dealing, as you have mentioned, with refugees who maybe don't speak very good English? How do you get round the communication difficulties? How do you have a sort of relationship with someone who's from such a different place and has suddenly found themselves somewhere where they, I'm guessing, had never expected to be?
Yeah, absolutely. Many families, may have known they were coming to the UK, but the UK is, for many, like London and Birmingham and the places they hear of that are hugely multicultural. So Belfast, Northern Ireland, or Enniskillen, or small places in Northern Ireland weren't what they were dreaming of. But I guess so. Relationships when working with refugees are huge, and it's very different when they come from different countries. So it'll be different, from the Syrians or the Afghans, the Ukrainian people coming into Northern Ireland, and you have to account for that. You have to account for where are they coming from, what was their norms, what are their culture, and therefore how do you adapt to be able to open up dialogue with them and to speak with them and to develop trust. So, for example, when it comes to the Syrians and Afghans, they very much take you in as a member of your family, their family, and that's how they want to treat you. But and obviously there's lines to be drawn there, but at the same time that's really conducive to building a really strong relationship. But we have to be really careful that we are enabling families to live independently in Northern Ireland and to connect with Northern Ireland, and not disabling them by feeling like we have to be there to help them. The whole point is that we need to teach them how to survive without us, without any member of our team or other charities being involved. So to offer that support. One of the biggest challenges in, I suppose, dealing with loneliness. So loneliness for anybody is hard to recognise. It's hard to say what it is. It's hard to identify because of stigma, because of shame, because people don't want to admit to feeling weak or vulnerable, or a lot of different assumptions that come with the idea of being lonely. What we have found over the years is that mental health in other countries just isn't approached in the same way as it is in the UK. So it would maybe be considered, you don't talk about that. That's not, it's like in Arabic, the language Arabic, they would use the word haram. So it's considered, it's nasty to talk about. So we've had to find new creative ways to talk about it, to explain what it is, and probably very much usually to avoid terms like mental health. And of course loneliness can tie into mental health issues. So we have to be creative in how we address it and how we ask about it. We do get to use interpreters. We're very lucky in that. Being a government-funded scheme, we are lucky that we do get to use interpreters. But we do have, families that have come in speaking English, particularly Afghan families. So that's a big difficulty, particularly for children as well. When something like this has never been addressed, when something like being lonely, being isolated, being in a new country, and recognising the effect and the impact, physiological, psychological, emotional, and how this presents, then it's a whole new learning prospect for them. It's lots of people, when you live here or you speak the language or you've grew up here, whatever it is, you will understand the term loneliness probably, more than you maybe want to. But to try and explain that, and we've had to break that down, talk about, tell me how you sleep, how's your eating patterns, do you often go out, do you know your neighbours, can I introduce you to your neighbour, do they know your name, how would you like me to help you, meet other people? So it's very much, you want the families to take the lead, but sometimes they just don't know how in a new country. They would have known, in their own home, here's what I do to go and be sociable. And they are very sociable. So I guess it's a benefit that there are growing numbers of refugees in Northern Ireland, because that has created its own sense of community. But within that, there are lots of different reasons why people remain lonely. And I think as social workers, I think it's really about drilling down and recognising it and being happy to address it and call it for what it is, but do it in a way where somebody doesn't feel like they're being judged, or they don't feel like, oh, it's really bad that I am admitting to feeling like this. And I have friends I'm even thinking of, but we have families that are really busy. They have kids and the schools, they have doctor's appointments, they have things that families do. But a busy life doesn't equals a life without loneliness. And when you're thinking of what people have lost, the bereavement they've lost, their bereavements, their feelings of grief, their panic, because the countries are still, the countries they came from are still at war, and then new wars come up, and they become probably slightly obsessed with news from home, news from surrounding countries, news from their families, and that is a huge worry if you think you have another family member still at risk in a country who can't leave, can't get out, and can't come to the safety that you're living in. And that in itself, and I recognise this, that in itself, assuming that because they're here, they're safe, isn't always true, because it's such a big change. It's so much learning, it's such a new culture, it's isolating and creates loneliness all by itself. So it's very, very, as Stephen said earlier, multifaceted. Loneliness isn't simple to identify, but certainly as social workers, and with the training, with the values, the value-based, the relationship, the communication skills, all of those things, it's about being able to recognise what you're looking at. I had asked some of my team, and I'm going to continue this, reflect on a situation that was quite difficult when things were going wrong for a person in whatever way that was presenting, and ask yourself, did you consider loneliness to be a factor? Was loneliness impacting everything else, creating everything else? So I think it's slowing down to stop and think of that as a basis. Is that person lonely? Are they making connections? Are they feeling valued? Are they feeling part of society? Are they feeling part of their family? Are they feeling part of their community? And also, I guess, I had somebody say to me, loneliness or making connections isn't always about people. It can be made in other ways. It's not always about being face to face with somebody, and it mightn't even be about about a person. It may be, for example, about animals. It may be about finding a hobby that you enjoy, where you get to interact with people as a consequence of doing something, but the people aren't actually the thing that you're going for. So I think it's being creative and thinking outside the box a bit and helping people to recognise it and deal with it.
And could I just add, I think that everything you said is so powerful there, but it brought into mind the innovations around men's sheds. And one of the big pieces of learning that came from that was, and I'm not being sexist, Stephen, sorry, but part of the research in that showed that, men don't talk face to face, they talk shoulder to shoulder. So what a better way to encourage that connection than to actually invent this brilliant initiative of Men's Shed, which allow men to do what they want and to increase their social connections in a way that feels more natural to them. And I know in the children's hospice, we had experiences of trying to target the dads, and they were like, don't you social work me, don't you try and do any therapy on me. So we just did fun things instead and give them the opportunity to have that peer-led support systems that very naturally evolved. That one minute you could be sitting doing a surfing lesson up in Portrush, and then the next they're having conversations about accessible vehicles and whether it's worth putting the extra to buy a bigger one. Things that I could never know. But they know themselves. And I think as social workers, we're uniquely placed to be able to explore and tune in. Any social work student that's listening to this will be like, for goodness sake, stop talking about tuning in. But it's so important, because we can explore sometimes just in our own minds, that psychological and sociological theories and our own social work theories that help us to understand where somebody might be and what they will need. And I think that's a really unique thing that social workers bring to the table, that we can understand human behaviour and perhaps what is driving it, and that we have the bravery to tackle it and to say, this is what's going on. I think that you are lonely. Are you lonely? Let's talk about that.
And with that experience of yours, I mean, what would your advice be to social workers about why they should look out for loneliness and address it, and how as well?
Yeah, I think that's key, isn't it? And I think that loneliness is such a huge social determinant of health that it's something that we need to tackle. It's something that we as professionals need to be acutely aware of, and something that we are brave enough to ask. And I think it is just having the bravery to ask that simple question, are you lonely? And finding a way that feels natural for you to ask, that is easily understood by your audience and by the person that's sitting in front of you. And not be afraid to name it, I think. And then know what you're going to do afterwards. So saying you're lonely is one thing, but knowing what to do afterwards. So know what's available within your local community, whatever that might be that hospice wide, or be that South Belfast wide, be that for every refugee in the country. Know what's available and know what you can offer. Be clear about what that is, but be boundaried. We cannot replace family or community or all those social connections, but we can absolutely be the instrument that starts to drive that change for that individual. So be clear about what you can and can't do, and link in with those who can provide a little bit more. But I do think that sometimes just breaking down that barrier and talking about that loneliness is the first step. So do it. Be brave and do it.
Stephen, I suppose one of the aims is to try to intervene before loneliness becomes a really major problem. So how do you kind of worm your way in there to, maybe by saying the word, or by saying, are you lonely? Maybe that's absolutely the right thing for some people. Maybe with somebody else it might actually, they might take it the wrong way, if I could put it like that. So how do you try to do that intervention maybe before the person themselves really realises that that's one of the things that's wrong?
So initially it'll come down to your relationship with that person. And I think that's developing that honesty and trust, as Jeanine said, is in building that relationship yourself. You can then act as the bridge to other people. And I think that the one thing that both the ladies have said is social workers are a bridge. You will be that bit for people to walk across to the other side, to these connections that you can make. And I think for social workers, it is being honest. It's being straight with people, that you recognise and understand their difficulties, that there are a multitude of issues that they're facing, and how they respond to where they are in themselves, and the options that you offer is how you will direct that person to find what is suitable for them. And I think it is being very much focused around that person's. It's not a one set fits all, and Men's Sheds is a fantastic resource. I also think that day centres are a fantastic resource, but as Aislinn said, day centres are much more female based, because you can have that chat across a cup of tea and a cup of coffee, and as Aislinn said, men do definitely work shoulder to shoulder much better. It's all at the grinding wheel, and sort of taking their experiences of their work experience and their life experiences, of having that side by side attitude with their peers and colleagues, and they will then lead the conversation, as very much as Aislinn says. You can get them in for an initial surfing, whatever it may be, will lead to that conversation of, well, how do we fix this car, or how do we put this together? And I think it's finding that niche for each individual person, and directing them to where they need to be, and giving them that bit of support, knowing that if things don't always go perfect, that they can come back and touch base with you, and you'll be that safety net for them. I will catch you again, but I'll help you stand back up, and then we have to walk again. And it is, as very much as Jeanine said, it's building that capacity in themselves of how they then start to direct things. We can support you in being there, but we can't walk you the whole way. And it's giving back the responsibility to that person. It's very much as developing a loneliness strategy is to give that person their abilities back. And that's one thing we're finding, is that the impact on health, if we can build them a social network, the likelihood is that the impact of their health predicaments is going to reduce. The impact of trauma is going to reduce, on the basis that they're having other people that they can talk to. And a lot of people in Northern Ireland have the same experience. And it's maybe, back in the Troubles days, it was communities against each other. But both communities faced the same ideas. They both had that same issue of loose lips sink ships, and having that interconnection of what they lost. And what we're finding is that loss is massive, and especially in older people. It's the loss of not just their ability or their loved ones or their social connections. It's a general idea of, I don't have these things anymore. I'm too old to be building these new networks. I'm just going to give up. And it's trying to make them realise that our whole life course, we all have those bits and pieces where things haven't worked out. We leave school. All our friends that we had in school don't always follow with us, and we transition into a new place, and then we develop, when we're in our late 20s and we're getting married and stuff like that there. Your network changes again. All your friends don't transfer with that, and it's making people realise that this is something they have experienced before, and it's something that they can get through. It's just having the ability to say to them, we can see where you are, but you've been here before. Let us show you how to get to the next step, and it is really moving them forward.
It's an enormously complex issue, all of this, isn't it, Jeanine? And also, I mean, the people that you're dealing with, in fact, the people that all three of you are dealing with, are in situations which are enormously complex. So where does loneliness fit then on the kind of ladder, if you like? I mean, everything's vying for time, for money, for people, and so on. So how important is it, do you feel, that loneliness is tackled in the right way by the social workers who are involved?
I think it's extremely important, because you're right. When you're working with a family, and particularly a family who know nothing about Northern Ireland, then you're thinking about things like their housing situation, their financial situation, how they're going to feed their kids, how they're going to learn to do A, B, C, D, E, and right down to Z. There's so much learning, and there's advocating, and there's encouraging them to learn how to access services. It's encouraging the services to open their doors and be as welcoming as they can be in allowing people to come in and use their services. And you can get so caught up in the busyness of doing that actually you have to be conscious to, I suppose, dial it down and dial it back and spend time. And I will admit that in the voluntary capacity that we work in, we do have, I suppose, the luxury of time to a degree, because we can give the time to just sitting. When you get the priority items kind of out of the road, and they're done and they're settled, and families are asking for those too. They're saying, well, what about this? What about that? What about education for my kids? They have their priorities too. So when those are addressed, then that opens up time to just sit down and start asking about, who are you? Tell me about yourself, what happened in the past, and you start to learn much more about that. And it can be really eye-opening, because for all the training you do with, to work with refugees, for all the training that myself and my team have done, there's nothing quite as powerful as just hearing somebody's story and learning from it. And I'm in a unique position. I've worked in social care for 27 years and then decided to become a social worker. So I'm actually just in my AY year this year. But I've also been an on-site supervisor for a social work student, and watching him learn, both as a new social worker myself and as a team manager who has worked with refugees for years now and worked in social care for a long time, it has been a surprising learning for me, because I'm watching him develop and learn from his perspective. And that has introduced really new interesting ideas as well, coming from social work theories and his values and his own value basis. So that's been really interesting. And it has opened up the team's eyes to other things that, I mean, every day is a learning day, and you have to always be open to learning. But learning from families themselves, because they are really the masters of their own lives. And sometimes our empathy and our compassion can lead to feeling like we're doing a disservice if we're not there every second of the day. And for an example, I got really worried about a family over Christmas once, and I was told in no uncertain terms, which was funny, I did bring my family of 7 across multiple countries and get here in one piece. I can't survive without you for 2 weeks. And that's so true. So it's a bit of a balancing act too, that you want to advocate and encourage and create those connections. And it's extremely important to recognise loneliness, as I said, as nearly being under everything, and just try and bring yourself back to, once all the business is done, bring yourself back to thinking, what else is here for this family and individuals within it. Because in the families that we work with, very often it may be the man who goes to work, who does a lot of the stuff outside of the house, and then the female might be more responsible for a lot of the child rearing and child caring. But if disability is introduced, then it takes a real family effort for that. Everybody in that family can get lonely. Other children without disabilities, if there's one that has a disability, others don't, can become lonely. So I think it's extremely important to really, as Aislinn said, tune in, look at everything that's feeding into that family and ask yourself, can loneliness be playing a part here? So despite that you want to create an independence, you also have to ask, as Stephen said, what more do they need? Is there anything else that we can do? Because if you can't walk away without knowing that you've done everything in your power to put that family in a position where they feel they can live a full life in Northern Ireland. And of course, with time, as Stephen said, that changes. Things change, and therefore it's being open to always stepping back in when needed, when things continue to change for families.
How can someone ask for social work support for loneliness, Stephen?
So any person in the community can refer themselves in to social services, and it will be screened in relation to that. I think we need to also look at the valued role that social care does play, and they are sometimes our first port of contact, and they would be the first people that alleviate some of the loneliness that older people will experience. Having that person call 4 times a day could be the only time they see people in a day. So it's using the things that they have at present. If they are attending day services, they can have a conversation with the staff there, the carers that come in with them. Family as well. There's a lot in the community in relation to social services. We've a community connected hub in relation to services that are community based, and it's just asking the question, and I think that's the biggest thing for older people is they don't ask the question, or they don't see people enough to ask the question, and it's opening the conversation. I've always been something that I've always said social work doesn't get the recognition it deserves of the dances that we do in the grey areas, and I know they done a lot of PR for nurses back in the 70s and 80s, and I think that's a trick social work misses out on, that we need that idea of what we actually can do, and that to be pushed with the community, because there is a stigma on social work that we're only there to either take your kids or put them in or your parents into a care home, and that's not something that, especially for older people, for us a care home is always the last place, and it is maintaining people in the community that we always want, and that's what we aim to do. It's getting that joined up picture of what's available in the community, the current packages of care, and then the social work and the complexities that follow through that other sectors can't deal with can then come to social work, and that we can be the ones that point you in the direction and have those difficult conversations, as Aislinn said, where sometimes we are the only people that will broach a certain subject in relation to what comes next. How do we get you from where you are now to the next place you need to be? You need to be looking at this as your potential future. Your future planning is, and it's having that dark and difficult conversation of where they are. What are your final wishes? What are your choices at the end? Because some, as Aislinn says, very few people will ask that question. And with Jeanine as well, what she's finding is that those difficult conversations of what they've lost, and some refugees have came away from what was a previously well-built, happy community to something absolutely brand spanking new to them. They have no idea of how to do it. And there might, as Jeanine says, there might be family members that they don't have with them, and that added level of concern, which will always permeate everything that they're doing. They're actively trying to engage, but the concerns of the family member not with them is in the background, bubbling with them. And it's having that realisation that the trauma for all three of us here, that trauma does have an impact, and it will play a massive role in how we manage our current situations and building that support network for all, from youth right up to the older age and refugees. It's the connections, and that's the one big thing for social work, is that we can be that connecting force. As I said before, we do act as a bridge, and it's realising how important social work is in being that bridge and directing the avenues that can benefit not only refugees and younger people, but also for older people and myself.
Can I just add a step in there too? I think a big part of it too, and this happens very, very much happens in what we do. We don't do any of this alone. A collaboration for us is huge, because if you're, for us, resettling a family into a country isn't just about what we can do in the day-to-day stuff. You know, health, education, social security, housing, all of the systems in Northern Ireland have to be involved and play a part and do, and therefore it's very much about cooperation, collaboration, and involving everybody who need to be involved to be able to address it. And that's, it's kind of creating a wider net, I suppose, and a wider safety net, as you say, so that there is somebody there to address it. I think also when it comes to accessing social work, as you did mention the stigma and what, how people may feel about social work, and I think it's really important that we do this a lot with families, in talking about what social services are, what social work is, what happens, and trying to actually make them understand that this does not have to be negative. If you are suffering in any way and your family need help, then social work aim to offer you that and to keep your family together, to create opportunities for you to grow and develop and move forward. So I think that it's really important to share those messages, and also not let people feel like they're a burden. I'm thinking of my own mum, and she always just felt like she was being a burden if she asked for any help as she got older. So I think it's really important for the people understand that you're not creating a situation that is going to become more difficult for you, that actually asking for support is a strength in itself.
Just ask, I've written down here, and I think that seems to be the right way to go about it. Look, thanks to all of you so much for being with us today. We've been talking about connections across the garden wall and social work and loneliness. Thanks to Stephen, to Aisling and to Jeanine for your time and your insight, and thank you for listening to Care to Chat. You can catch all the episodes of this, and indeed the first series, on the Northern Ireland Social Care Council website or wherever you get your podcasts. Please do subscribe and rate us, and of course tell all your friends and colleagues. Thanks for listening.